The present purpose is to work with both the BHS critical apparatus and the BHQ critical apparatus for a problem in Zechariah chapter 11. And the nature of this problem appears to be an accidental scribal variant. So we'll try to determine what to do. Now again, the BHS has in the margin the Masora Parva, and these are Masoretic notes reproduced that go with the Leningrad Codex as it is in the text. And then the Masora Magna is not reproduced in the BHS, but there's a list of places that a person can look theoretically in the separate printed volume. And then at the bottom of the page is the modern editor's interactions with scribal variations in the ancient world and also suggested emendations. Our focus will be to compare how the apparatus functions in the BHS versus how it functions in the BHQ. Zechariah chapter 11 verse 7, there are two places where the editor of the BHS has notations. We're just going to focus on the first one. You'll notice there's two letter A's, and so what the note at the bottom of the page concerns is the materials found between the two letter A's. And so then what the editor does is provides a very compact notation about the terms there, and it uses different symbols as well as Latin abbreviations, and even provides the alternate reading from the Septuagint in all of this. At first, it seems really daunting to the student to decode notations like this, but like anything else, after a short learning curve and regular practice, most of the notes are fairly easy to interpret. It is highly advantageous for the student to take these very compact notations and convert them into straightforward English. And so let's work through this piece by piece. The letter L is the Latin abbreviation for read. And so what the editor of the BHS is saying is, instead of what we find in the Leningrad Codex between these two letter A's, lachen aniye, instead of that, read likna aniye. That is, instead of this, therefore the afflicted of, read in Canaan, or, if it's not a proper name, to the merchants of. Then the editor says, compare the Septuagintal reading, namely, in Canaan, and compare chapter 11, verse 11, where there's a similar situation. So in short, this is a reasonably light emendation suggestion. Rather, the question is spacing and what the words are. So is it therefore the afflicted, or is it in Canaan, or to the merchants of? And it's just a little bit tricky, and so we're going to have to consider it further. But in short, the Masoretic text reads something like, and I shepherded the flock to be slaughtered, even the most afflicted of the flock. I'm only reading up to the et nocta here. And the BHS apparatus suggests to change this to, and I shepherded the flock to be slaughtered for Canaan, or to the sheep merchants. Again, depending on whether this term is taken as the Canaanites, as it is in the Septuagint, or whether we take it as the term for merchants. to look at the last part of this notation with verse 7 between the two letter A's, I want to compare that. It says to compare this to verse 11. And so looking at verse 11, we see virtually the same thing repeated over. So the BHS, that is the Leningrad Codex, has both verse 7 and verse 11. There's a space saying, thus the afflicted of, or, as the editor is suggesting, should these both be taken as to Canaan, like the Septuagint does. Here's the same passage, Zechariah chapter 11, but now this is in the BHQ. We'll notice a lot of things are the same as the BHS. That is, there's a representation of the Leningrad Codex, mistakes and all, here in the main text. The Masora Parva, the small Masora, is in the margin, very similar. Yet here's a big difference. The Masora Magna, instead of being printed in a separate volume, it's actually printed out here on the page. We're not going to concern ourselves with this today. We're just going to focus rather on the apparatus at the bottom of the page. You'll notice a much more substantial apparatus at the bottom of the BHQ pages in general. There's a few differences in the way the BHQ is laid out. Verse numbers are kept in the margins. They're not in the text. We also notice that there's no editor's notes in the text alerting us to things. So in this case, in the apparatus itself, the concerns of the editor, those terms are retyped. And so then we can see it that way. And then we notice there's occasionally a vertical line, and then here there's two vertical lines. So all of this is relative to this term, lachen aniye, and then there's three different readings of it, divided up by the vertical lines. Then after the double vertical lines, the editor of the BHS gives his opinion of what to do. And then finally, at the very end of this notation, there's a symbol here which tells us that there's also an additional commentary about this notation, which is found in the end of the text. So overall, we're in a similar situation in some respects, where we need to decode the apparatus using the glossary in the front of the volume. However, happily, there is this is in English abbreviations rather than Latin. The student will do well to try to decode the different text notes in the BHQ into straightforward English. In this case, there's sort of 4 notes, and we'll divide these up using semicolons, and so we'll focus upon each one very briefly. So the first note then is that Zechariah 11:7 in the NT reads, Lache eniye, therefore the afflicted of. And then the editor says, and verse 11 similarly reads, Cain niye, thus the afflicted of. Then he lists these various other witnesses to this reading. So it's not just the Proto-MT version, but also we see the same division of words in 4Q Pesher Isaiah C, that is 4Q 163, that's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's one of the sectarian scrolls. Also, Aquila, Vulgate, and the Targum. So there's several witnesses that agree then with the verse division, or the word division rather, of the MT for both verse 7 and verse 11. Then the next note reads, for the reading in Canaan, or the Canaanites, in verse 7 and verse 11 in the Septuagint, which the editor of the BHQ, his judgment is that this is because the division of the text is different in the Septuagintal Vorlage. That is, this note here, this differ-div, there's a set of abbreviations or a typology in the front of the BHQ where the editor is telling very specifically the user his opinion in the case of these Septuagintal readings is because the text is divided differently, or to put it specifically, because these two words aren't separated in verse 7 and verse 11, but they're together in the text that the Hebrew text that the Septuagintal translator was working with. In the next note, we have two Sirach readings from verse 7 and verse 11 respectively, and so that is he offers us these two similar Peshitta readings. Then again, finally, after the double vertical lines, the editor gives us his preference, and so he prefers the terms joined together in both verse 7 and verse 11, and he says, see Septuagint. So he regards the Vorlage, the parent text of the Septuagint in Hebrew, as a more original reading than the term separated into two terms in the Proto-Masoretic tradition. Thus, his preference is to see both verse 7 and verse 11, and he says compare with the Septuagint. Then again, this notation here says take a look at the commentary for further explanation. Now when we take a look at the BHQ commentary on Zechariah 11:7, we notice that even here there's still this commitment to brevity with a good number of abbreviations that either need to be looked up until one becomes familiar with them. And so, again, just offering an interpretation of the note relative to these two terms in verse 7 and verse 11. And the BHQ commentary, the editor says, see Bartholomew for strong arguments in favor of the Septuagintal reading. So he points us to a text that he's worked with, and the G here stands for the Septuagintal reading. Then he notes that the Peshitta agrees with the Masoretic text in verse 11, but verse 7 is very difficult. So again, the S stands for the Peshitta, M stands for the Masoretic text, and they agree in verse 11, but verse 7 is difficult. Finally, the editor lists some alternate evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the sectarian text, and he says to take a look at this alternate reading. So if we look up 4Q 163, it agrees with the MT, namely, thus the most helpless of the flock. So again, he's first explaining his judgment, but then he does show that the Masoretic reading is very old and was competing with the reading in the Septuagintal Vorlage, and so that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian text actually follows the Proto-Masoretic reading. Now, the next steps after decoding the BHS and or BHQ apparatus is to evaluate the external evidence. And so I'm not going to do a full-blown here, that's handled elsewhere, but just to give a preview of the next steps. So again, we have kind of two different, very ancient ways to go. One separated into two words, the other is the single term. Namely, the Masoretic tradition, represented also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that the term is in this phrase in the first half of the verse up to the anakta, and I shepherded the flock to be slaughtered, even the most afflicted of the flock. However, the Septuagint has, and I shepherded the flock to be slaughtered for the Canaanites. Now again, if we're thinking in terms of the forlaga of the Septuagint, that is the text, the Hebrew text from which the Septuagintal translators translated, we still have to yet decide if this term is to be understood as the Canaanites, or if this is not a proper name, but rather is a term for merchants. So since the editor of the BHQ preferred the Septuagint, student may want to evaluate the Septuagintal reading for oneself. And so this is available in the less critical edition online in Ralph's. But the Göttingen edition is very expensive, and one would need to go to a library for that. There's English translations of the Septuagint. There's both a new Netz translation put out by Oxford, but also the older Breton edition, and both of these are available online. So the student is able to take a look at some of the contextual issues related to this. After assembling and evaluating the external evidence, the next step is to evaluate internal evidence. And here I'm just previewing this in a summary way. A more detailed approach is handled elsewhere. So again, this is the circumstance that we found from assembling the external evidence. Now internally, we want to look at some contextual issues to see if there's anything that helps us go with either the Masoretic reading or the Septuagintal reading. And one of the things to take note is in verse 5, a couple of verses before. And verse 5 talks about the ones who acquire them, they kill them, and they are not punished. And the ones who sell them, they say, blessed be the Lord, for I have become rich. So the one interesting thing here to consider is if this buying and selling in the context might support, for example, the idea of the Septuagintal reading, but not as a proper name, rather as a term for merchants. And then one other point to take note of, in a more distant context, near the end of the book, where the nations are streaming to restore Jerusalem to take part in the tabernacle's worship, yet there's an exception, that there will not be the Canaanite or merchant again in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. So again, both of these two other passages give us pause to consider what might be going on in chapter 11, verses 7 and 11. It's helpful for evaluating these things to compare some of the commentaries which deal with text-critical issues. And a very convenient one available online, offering many student-oriented notations, is the Net translation and their text-critical notes throughout the text. And so this is what appears in the Net Bible under Zechariah 7:11. So in the first part of their note, they are just listing out the evidence, what we've already discovered, that the Masoretic reading, therefore the most afflicted of, versus the Septuagintal forlaga, being something like to the merchants of. Yet notice in this case, they go in a different direction than both the BHS and BHQ editors, who both suggested going with amending it to the Septuagintal. Rather, because there's no other attestation or justification, they don't view the Septuagintal witness as enough for them in this case. And so the MT is usually followed in English translations. So the student comes up to a situation, and after decoding the apparatus, evaluating the external evidence, evaluating the internal evidence, needs to make a decision. How do we read this? And I would say that's probably the front end thing to do, to make a decision. Often, as in this case, the external nor the internal evidence is compelling, and so it makes it very difficult for us, and we should think through the two different kinds of ways to go in many cases. One of the principles that's often used is that the more difficult reading is preferred. Now, this is just a general rule of thumb, and one has to be cautious. It's not a law, but it's more like, as the pirates say, it's more like guidelines, really. And so, in this case, if we went with the more difficult, then we'd stick with a Proto-Masoretic reading of thus the afflicted ones. But beyond making the decision, also suggest that part of the value in the BHS and the BHQ apparatus is alerting us as readers to difficulties in the text and also some ancient variations, and these provide exegetical opportunities for preaching and teaching.